Hello, and welcome to your expense reports, reporting, and travel presentation. Please make sure to have your questionnaire available for review and completion. Once completed, please return to your program officer within 1 week. We will now start this presentation with reports and travel. For your international travel to assignment, you will be provided with a ticket from your home base to host city. In this previous email attachment, you should have a copy of the Fly America Act. All tickets purchased by Georgetown have to follow the Fly America Act. It's also important that all travel is purchased by Georgetown University. If a fellow chooses to purchase their own travel, it's very likely that Georgetown will not be able to reimburse them. Your international travel will be purchased. Once all of your fellow documents have been returned, you've signed your fellowship agreement, and you've confirmed your visa status. That means either you know how to apply for your visa in country, or you've already received your visa and have it in hand. You then need to email that information to your program officer at Georgetown. In addition to that, you have to have also received your first fellowship payment, or you need to email your program officer and let them know that you are willing to depart without having first received the first fellowship payment. This doesn't mean that you will not receive your first fellowship payment, just that it may not arrive until you're already in country. First fellowship payments per your fellowship agreement are issued within 60 days of signing the fellowship agreement and setting up your banking information. The program only purchases one-way tickets due to the variable nature of living and working abroad. So we will issue a one-way ticket from your home base to host city, and then at the end of fellowship, we will issue a ticket from your host city to home base. We also have something that we provide called dummy round-trip tickets. This is for visa purposes only, and if you need this, your local embassy will tell you, or whoever's assisting you with your visa application. You then let your program officer know, and we'll be able to issue that for you. It's important to note that any kind of dummy ticket for visa purposes only will not reflect your actual travel. You will also receive a shipping allowance in your first fellowship payment. This is included your first and your next to last fellowship payment. And this is outlined in your fellowship agreement, and this will help cover any baggage fees. The allowance is for $700, so you receive $350 in the first payment and $350 in the next to last payment. If you exceed the $700 trying to get your belongings to assignment, then those costs are then considered out of pocket. We can accommodate limited personal arrangements. If you have personal requests, it's best to send them to your program officer, and what we'll do is price out the personal request in the ticket you've requested and compare it to the base ticket that we're allowed to purchase from the program. If there's a cost difference, then we will let you know, and then you would need to pay that back to the program. If you have a dependent coming with you on your fellowship, Georgetown cannot pay for their travel, and the program cannot pay for their travel. So in that case, what we do is when your travel is ready to be booked, we go ahead and process that. Once your ticket has been reviewed and approved, then we will put you in touch with our travel agent, and you can arrange for your travel for your dependents with the travel agent. If you prefer not to and to arrange it on your own through Expedia or a different travel agency, that's perfectly fine as well. Program evaluation. So your fellowship in the program is evaluated in 3 different ways. The first includes fellow reports, the second is fellow surveys, and the third are site visits. Site visits are usually conducted through mid-year events. Mid-year events are not guaranteed for each region, and they're determined by State Department. So if a mid-year event will be happening in your region and you're invited to attend, the RELO will let you know. And then once State Department has approved everything, then Georgetown will be in touch with you. If State Department and the RELO approve for Georgetown to attend the mid-year event, then we will come and have a consultation with you. If not, then we will usually have a Skype consultation with you. But it's more of a touching base at the midpoint of your fellowship to see how things are going. For fellow reports, there is a preliminary report, a mid-year report, and a final report. These must all be submitted to your local embassy, which is PASS, your RELO, and to Georgetown at the following email address. You can also send it directly to your program officer. These report templates are on the Community of Practice. We are looking into reevaluating our reporting system. in our survey system. So if that happens, we'll let you know, and the update will also be on the Community of Practice. But in the meantime, these are there for you to review and be familiar with before they're due. The final report, it's also important to note, is tied to the final payment currently. So if you do not submit the final report, then you do not get the final payment. So that's losing out on, usually depending on your stipend, about $1,250. So it's important to note that. As I mentioned before, there's also another way in which we evaluate the fellowship in your program, and that's through fellow surveys. There's a post-arrival survey, a mid-year survey, an end-of-fellowship survey, and a post-fellowship survey, and we will send these to you in an email link. And also, as I mentioned before, this is something we're looking into reevaluating, and if that happens, we'll make sure to update you and also put the update on the Community of Practice. Okay, now on to expense reports. You will use an expense report in order to request a reimbursement, reconcile in advance, or for miscellaneous expenses incurred during your fellowship, and this must be approved beforehand. So when you're requesting a reimbursement, there are two scenarios. There's the $800 post-arrival orientation allowance, and then there's also your program activities allowance. When reconciling in advance, that comes from your program activities allowance. So it's a very similar expense report, and we'll go into the differences later on. And then the miscellaneous expenses, the most common case for this is if you are on your international travel to your host city, and there's a layover in between, and it's unavoidable, and you have to stay in a hotel that night, and then we will let you know that you can stay in a hotel and be reimbursed for those costs, but you do have to submit an expense report. So these are things that we will discuss with you beforehand, so you don't have to be aware of all the instances in which a miscellaneous expense report can come up. So the pieces of an expense report. You start out with the expense log, which is like a cover sheet or a tally sheet. Then you have the receipt forms with receipts attached. So you put one receipt per receipt form. You tally that up and then log them into the expense log. You also need to include a copy of a project plan, a budget, and written approval from your RELO or local embassy, again, PASS. This is needed for program activities allowance monies only. You also need to include a per diem worksheet if you're claiming per diem, an exchange rate backup, but only if purchases were made with a foreign currency. Exchange rate backup can include a credit card statement, a receipt from a currency exchange store, or an online currency exchange printout like Oanda or Xe.com. So this is an example of the expense log. As you can see, it's kind of a fillable cover sheet. So you're going to fill out your name, your country of assignment, your fellow status. This is the most important part, the reconciliation or the reimbursement. It's very important for you to know which is which. And this is important for your program officer and important for our finance team as well, because it's possible to request a reimbursement while you have an advance out. And if that happens, things can sometimes get a little confusing. So it's very important to note what you're doing with this expense report. You then include the expense date, a brief explanation of the expense, for example, hotel, things like that, the local currency amount, and then the amount in US dollars. Now underneath the expense log or your cover sheet is the receipt form. The receipt form is where things get a lot more detailed. So this is the who, what, where, when, and why of the money that you're claiming. And then you tape the original receipt to the bottom. This is an example of an Oanda exchange rate sheet. So it's pretty automated and simple. You go to the website, you enter in the currency you have, the currency you want, and the amount. So for example, if you spent 200 dirhams in Morocco and you want to see how much that's going to be in US dollars, then you would go to this website to figure that out. Going back to the things you use an expense report for, one of those items is the post-arrival orientation allowance. So for this allowance, and this is listed on the first page of your agreement, you're entitled to up to $800 for expenses including your hotel for the entire length of the orientation, ground transportation, or food or per diem. It's important to note, though, if the post-arrival orientation takes place in your host city, you cannot claim hotel or per diem if your housing has already been provided and you can never claim local ground transportation. Again, this is only if your host city and your post-arrival orientation city are the same city. If the this expense report must be sent to Georgetown within 60 days of the post-arrival orientation in order for you to receive reimbursement. So the difference between food per diem and receipts. When it comes to meals, you can either choose to claim a per diem rate or you can submit original receipts for those costs. If you're choosing to claim per diem, you're entitled to claim 75% on travel days and 100% for full days. It's really important that if you're claiming original receipts for food, it cannot exceed the per diem max. So either way, there is a built-in limit on what can be claimed. So again, going back, you're entitled to claim 75% on travel days and 100% for full days. And we'll show you how to pull up these rates and how to figure out the 75% and the 100%. Your RELO and or your PAO may request that you claim less. So if the local embassy requests that instead of claiming $50 for meals in the capital city of your country, they know it doesn't actually cost that much, and they may say your limit instead of $50 is going to be $25. So if that happens, you can only claim what they've set in place. If you are claiming per diem, you need to indicate it on the expense log and on a separate receipt form. So when we were looking at the receipt forms, you would do one just for per diem. You wouldn't have anything to attach to it, but you would fill out the column on the right-hand side that goes over per diem. It's important that the city and amount of days being claimed are stated. So you need to state where you're incurring the per diem and what days, because those can fluctuate depending on peak travel seasons, and the capital city compared to a very small city has different rates. You must also show backup for travel, such as a hotel receipt or transportation receipt, even if those expenses are not being claimed. This provides backup for the days in the city that you're claiming. So if you're claiming 3 days of per diem in the capital city, but your host city is not the capital city, then we need to see that you are actually in the capital city. That's where your hotel receipt comes in, or where a plane ticket to and from your host city and capital city comes in. It's just verifying that you are in the location you're saying you're in order to claim per diem. Per diem rates can change, so it needs to be verified every time you claim it, and we will show you the link to go to for that. It's a State Department link. So here is how to locate the correct per diem rate. You go to the following website, you pull up your country, then you pull up the date of travel, and then you find your city. So for example, if you look at the rate for Jakarta compared to the rate for Batam, it's very different. So that's why we ask for lots of backup and approval for per diem. Excuse me. So when you're looking at the maximum per diem rate, the maximum lodging rate, per diem rate is the total for everything. The maximum lodging rate will be for your hotels, and the meals and incidental rate will be for your food. You're not allowed to claim incidentals as a fellow, though. It's meals only, so you need to do a little math in order to figure that out by going to the following website. So when you go to this website, you'll look what the meals and incidental rate is on here, find it on this corresponding page, and then take out the incidentals column. So if your meals and incidental rate in Jakarta was $63, then you would have to subtract $13 for incidentals, and then you have a daily maximum per diem of $50 that you can claim. So for example, here's a more detailed one. You traveled from your home base of Jakarta to Banda Aceh on August 5th for a conference. The conference was from August 6th to August 8th, and then you traveled back from Banda Aceh to your home base of Jakarta on August 9th. So you have a $67 per diem rate minus the incidentals. So that's breakfast is $10, lunch is $17, dinner is $27. A full day is your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then a travel day is 75% of the full day. Now, when you add up the 2 full days of August 6th and August 7th, plus the 2 travel days of August 5th and August 8th, then you come up with your total allowable per diem of $243. And if you have any questions about per diem, we understand it's a bit complicated, so please feel free to contact your program officer with any questions. You're also more than welcome to use original receipts if you find per diem too complicated for food, and so you can just provide those in your expense report. So for your program activities allowance, I like to define it as a loan from the federal government. So it's not really your money, and because of that, it comes with lots of rules and restrictions. The amount of program activities allowance that each fellow is entitled to is listed on the first page of their fellowship agreement. So this can vary fellow to fellow. So just because one fellow receives X amount does not mean you're guaranteed X amount as well. Allowances are given to help support your fellowship activities. And again, this is where it comes into. It's a federal loan from the federal government territory. So because this is meant to help support your fellowship, everything you purchase with the program activities allowance must be donated at the end of your fellowship to either your host institution or to the local embassy. PAA funds are not given up front. They can be accessed via a request for an advance or a request for reimbursement with RELO and PASS approval. So anytime you spend your program activities allowance, it's very important that you have local embassy or RELO approval of those expenses. It can only be spent on allowable items. You can look at the fellow handbook for a list of allowable items, and this is in the reporting requirements, section R. And PAA is not considered income, so because of this, it will not be included on your 1099 miscellaneous tax form. Again, this is a loan to help fund your fellowship, so you're not going to be taxed on it because these are not any items that you're allowed to keep. It's things that you're leaving behind or trips that are meant to help enrich your fellowship. So some examples of allowable expenses include office supplies, photocopies, workshops, conferences, internet, electronic equipment such as a DVD player, a copy machine or camera, books, travel for yourself and for your host institution colleagues. Some non-allowable expenses include expenses for other fellows, dependents, or State Department or U.S. Embassy employees. So not those colleagues, just your host institution colleagues and local country people. That's the only travel that's allowed. Gifts for your host institution or speakers are not allowed. Alcohol is definitely not allowed. Anything included in a settling in allowance. So for example, if you're provided with internet and you're settling in allowance, then you are not allowed to claim that as a per diem expense because that's doubling up on the money you've received. Travel to the U.S. National TESOL Conference, because it's a fellowship, you're meant to stay in your country. And the U.S. TESOL Conference is more of a professional development activity. Memberships for yourself, again, this comes into, you can purchase memberships for your host institution colleagues because you're enriching their professional development, but it's not a time to do your own professional development. Local transportation in your host city, flowers, personal language lessons for yourself are also not an allowable PAA expense. So some past examples of PAA purchases include office supplies or photocopies, poetry and writing contests. You can provide prizes for those, bringing guest speakers to conferences. If you do bring a guest speaker, and we'll go over this in a couple of slides, there's a service agreements may be needed, letters of understanding. It can get a bit complicated, but again, we'll go over this in the next couple of slides. Funding travel for teachers to attend conferences is allowed. Cultural events, for example, holding a Halloween party or a Thanksgiving dinner. Purchasing digital cameras and then hosting a photography contest or putting together a photography book. Purchasing a flip video for posting web chats, an international TESOL membership for colleagues, but again, not for yourself. So going back to the approval that's required for spending this money. So because it's a loan meant to help fund your fellowship, the embassy and the embassy and the relo really have discretion over how this money is being spent. So it's more a conversation that you have with them to determine how to best spend this money. So going off of that, it's important to prepare a project plan, a budget, and have both approved by the local embassy, PASS, or relo, or your main point of contact at the U.S. Embassy. Will they know what to do or what I'm asking them? They should. Embassy staff rotate quite frequently, so it's possible they haven't worked with a fellow program before. If that's the case, feel free to shoot your Georgetown program officer an email and we can start facilitating that conversation. If you purchase something before getting approval, that does sometimes happen. We really don't encourage it because PAA has to be approved in order for Georgetown to reimburse it. So if you purchase something and your relo or local embassy says, no, we don't approve this purchase, then that's something that you're now out of pocket for. So it is really important to get approval. If you happen to purchase something and you didn't get approval beforehand, but you get approval after, that's fine and we'll still reimburse you, but it's just kind of taking a gamble. There's no formal template for the project plan or the budget. It can be very casual, and in the next couple of slides we'll show you an example. Written approval should be in the form of an email sent to the fellow and then forwarded to Georgetown University, so it's not like a document you have to get signed and mail all the way from Vietnam or anything like that. The project plan, budget, and written approval must be sent via email to receive in advance. A copy of the budget and approval must also be sent with the expense report to reconcile the advance or to request a reimbursement, even if it has been previously emailed. So it's best just to double up on approval. You want to make sure you send us an email approval so we can refer to it when we're reviewing your expense report, and then you also want to include it in the expense report so we have a complete document of your purchases and why they were purchased and if they were approved. Please note that even if unallowable purchases are approved by relo or the local embassy, the purchase may not be reimbursable. So if your relo mistakenly forgets that alcohol is not allowable and says they allow you to purchase 2 bottles of wines, you do have a fellow handbook, you've received this presentation, you know that's not allowable. So even with relo approval, we're going to say no, and then those would be out-of-pocket costs for you. So it's really important to become familiar with what things are allowable, what's not. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact your program officer. So here's an example of a pretty casual email approval request. So it's really, Dear Relo, I'm considering going to this conference. I estimate the cost will be X, Y, and Z. This is the total budget. Is this approved? And then the relo writes back and says, yes, this is fine, and that's your approval. So requesting and receiving an advance. An advance is different from a reconciliation, different from a reimbursement. So for the reimbursement, you're spending the money out of pocket, you're sending in your receipts, and Georgetown is reimbursing you out of the fact. If you know you have a huge purchase coming up, then you would request an advance. So if you're going to spend $1,000 on a laptop for your host institution's English department, and you know that you can't front that cost, then you would send in an advance request, and we would deposit the money in your account, you would spend it, and then you would reconcile it after the fact. So in order to do this, you need to send an email to elfreports@georgetown.edu or also your program officer. We say ELF reports because this is an account that's monitored by all the program officers. So just in case your program officer is stuck in a meeting all day or is not available that day or out of the office, someone will see it and make sure it gets started processing as soon as possible. The email must include the actual amount you're requesting. So don't just send a budget that's for a total of $1,000 as an attachment and be like, I would like an advance. We need to know that you want that full $1,000, and we need it to be very explicit because this is something you're going to have to reconcile, so that's a lot of responsibility. So we definitely need you to say, I am requesting X amount of money. It also must have a clear budget and written approval. Some pros of requesting in advance. Like I mentioned, you don't have to spend your own money. You'll have money to cover large expenses for traveling or electronics. Some cons include you must spend the money, collect and submit receipts within 90 days of the advance, and you cannot receive an additional advance until the previous advance has been reconciled. So with PAA reimbursements, you can sit on them for a month or two if you don't have the time to physically do the paperwork. But with a With an advance, you really have to reconcile it as soon as possible. So what if you spent less than the advance? If this happens, then you reconcile what you have money for. So if you requested an advance for $1,000, but the computer you were going to buy only ended up costing $800, you would reconcile the $800, and then the remainder can either be deducted from a future payment or reallocated to another expense. So you can either have your next stipend payment deducted by that amount, or you can choose to reallocate it to a different purchase you're going to make. So on top of the computer, you're also going to take this next trip. If it's reallocated, the new expense must have approval from the local embassy, because this is, again, a brand new expense, and they're determining how the entirety of your PAA funds can be spent. And if reallocated, then we can an additional advance can be issued. So the rule where an additional advance cannot be issued until the previous advance is reconciled, this is a slight exception to that. If you spent more than the advance, then you need to send the expense report with all the receipts. So if the computer, instead of costing $1,000, cost $1,200, you would send in the receipt for $1,200 with your expense report, and we will reimburse you for the $200, so the part that you have not already been paid, that advance. Do not request an advance for additional money spent over the advance. So you've requested the advance for $1,000, it costs $1,200. Don't email for another advance for $200. Just send everything in, and you'll get a smaller reimbursement. So the reimbursement for $200, since you've already gotten the payment for $1,000. So in order to request a reimbursement, you must send the expense report and the original receipts to Georgetown. You need to include the budget and the written approval with the expense report. You do not need to send an email requesting a reimbursement prior to sending the expense report, so that's different from the advance. Some pros to this: the 90-day deadline does not apply, so like I said, you could sit on it for a month or two. You don't have to worry about expenses falling through. These are things that you're requesting reimbursement for after the fact, so you already know these expenses have occurred. Whereas if you're requesting an $1,000 advance for a trip to your capital city, but then that trip gets canceled, then you have $1,000 that you have to reconcile. So if you're doing a reimbursement, not an issue at all. Some cons include that you must spend your own money and then be paid back later. And your reimbursement may be delayed if you hold on to receipts and send them all at one time. So while I said you could sit on a reimbursement and expense report for a month or two until you have time, we really recommend that you don't wait your entire fellowship to send it in as one packet. A lot of fellows end around the same time, so if everyone waits until the end to send all of their expense reports for their entire fellowship, it creates a really large backup, and then it slows down the payment process. So if you do that, then you're doing it with the knowledge that your payment will take longer than if you had broken them up throughout your fellowship and sent them in every couple of months. So receipts, this is very, very important. All receipts do have to be original. We can't accept copies. You would mail the receipts through the U.S. Embassy or using a courier service. So FedEx, DHL, local mail system, or with permission, you can sometimes use the U.S. Embassy dip pouch. There's no tracking for that. So if it gets lost, it's a little bit harder to prove, but it's my understanding it's cheaper. Not all embassies will approve use of the dip pouch, so it's a case-by-case basis, and it's an exception as well. It's also important to make photocopies in case the originals are lost in the mail. This is the only time that we cannot accept original receipts. If photocopies are not made and your originals have been lost, you will not be reimbursed. You need to allow at least 4 to 6 weeks, depending on your location, for expense reports to arrive in DC. So you're in international locations that has to go through customs. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to us. Even if the person in your host city at the local post office says, oh, it'll be there in 2 weeks, no problem, still give it 4 to 6 weeks. International mail can take quite a while. Make sure to save a receipt and take a picture of the postage when you send it. This can be your proof of having mailed the receipts, in the original receipts, in case those are lost, and then we would be able to accept the copies in this one exception. Your receipts must be itemized. Itemized means, when you go to a hotel and they provide you with two receipts. There's the credit card receipt that you sign that just has the total, and then there's the full itemized receipt that shows you went to the menu bar, that you ordered room service, that you ordered a movie, and then you stayed 3 nights plus taxes. So we need the itemized receipts with all of the details. If you don't send an itemized receipt, we may not be able to accept it. Gas mileage versus, gas versus mileage. So when you're driving a car, you can claim it 2 different ways. So for your personal car, you can claim mileage, which is, the rate changes, but I think right now it's 0.56 cents per mile. And then you would total up the miles you drove. So I drove to this conference. It was 200 miles times 0.56 cents, and that's your total. Or if you rented or borrowed a car, then you would claim the gas. So the mileage is for your personal car only because it's an estimate for gas cost, deterioration, things like that. And if this is not your personal car, then you can't claim the deterioration, etc. So you can only claim the gas. With receipts, it's also important to deduct personal or unallowable expenses. So if you have a dinner receipt while you're staying at a conference and you order an alcoholic beverage, that's fine. Just make sure to cross that out and not include it in the total. And if your receipt is written in your host country's native language, please make sure the vendor has written the total in Arabic numerals, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just because we unfortunately do not have a team of translators in our office ready to translate receipts. So if a receipt is unavailable, you will be able to document it and still provide some backup for us. So in order to do that, you will either be sent a receipt book, or if not, here is a copy of a receipt log that you can just copy and paste. It's very simple. It just says the date, and this one is specifically for a taxi log, but you can adjust it for printing or things like that, things that where it's typically really hard to get a receipt for. So date, starting location, destination, cost, and then the initial of the person who provided you with the service. And it is important to note that we will notice if the initials also match the handwriting for the entire expense report. So it's important to actually get the taxi driver to sign off on this. And a brief disclaimer, it is up to Georgetown's discretion whether or not to accept a handmade receipt. All handmade receipts must include the vendor's signature and details of the purchase. And all handmade receipts that are for expenses where receipts can normally be obtained or over $25 may be questioned. So if you're submitting a handmade receipt for a flight, where almost always you can get a receipt, we're definitely going to have questions about that.
Another example of how to use PAA is to give a grant to one of your colleagues. To give a grant to your colleague, you must include the following information: the name of the person receiving the grant, the purpose of the grant, the budget. Include in there the conference registration budget, transportation, hotel, food, but you cannot say the word per diem. You must give them a food allowance. The other information that must be included in this grant is the grantee's signature and date when funds have been given to them from you, and then also your signature and the date when the funds were given to the grantee. On the next slide, you will see an example of a grant for a colleague. Here is the example for a grant for a colleague. Please take a look, and if you would like to have a clearer description, you may email your program officer for more details. One other way to use your PAA is to create a service agreement. This is a contract prepared by Georgetown University for a service being provided. Some examples of this are conference setup and cleanup, or a speaker at a conference or workshop. These must be used when the person is not with an organization or company and cannot provide receipts. To create a service agreement, please contact your program officer at Georgetown to start this process.
Okay, when using your program activities allowance to purchase plane tickets, you must purchase plane tickets on U.S. carriers whenever possible due to the Fly America Act. So because this is a U.S. government-funded program, we do have to adhere to the Fly America Act. If U.S. carriers are unavailable, please make note of that on the receipt form, and we understand that this is probably going to happen a lot. Obviously, traveling from Vietnam to Mongolia, it's going to be very hard to find a Delta carrier. So when that happens, just make a note of it on the receipt. No American carriers were available. Boarding passes also must be included in expense reports to show proof of travel. So if boarding passes are not available, you must report that to Georgetown via email or on the receipt form. So a few examples of things not to do when doing an expense report. Do not send loose receipts. We will mail those back to you. This is a training on how to combine expense reports, and there's well over 100 fellows, so it's important to try your best to put this together as completely as possible. Do not estimate amounts, generalize or include vague explanations. So if you purchased a ticket to Beijing, don't say this cost around $300. We need to know exact amounts. And again, this goes back to this being federal money, specifically for the purpose of your fellowship and not personal money. Describing something as just office supplies or food is not an adequate explanation. It's important to put why these things, so that's on the receipt form, the who, what, where, when, and why. So I went to X conference for the purpose of teacher development and spent X amount of money on food. It's important to be complete in your explanation. Do not send a bill for 1 month and request a reimbursement for multiple months based on that one bill. So this comes up a lot with internet or phone. So if you have a reoccurring monthly phone bill, you still have to submit each monthly phone bill that you receive. You can't submit the first one and then ask for reimbursement for the following 10 months. Do not include multiple receipts on one receipt form. The only exception is if you can group like expenses. So if you took 3 taxis on your conference trip, then you could include those 3 taxis on one receipt form. What you can't do is put the hotel receipt, the taxi receipt, and then a food receipt all on one receipt form. Do not list per diem $100. We need a lot more background information, so we need the city you're claiming per diem for, and the dates of travel must be listed. If you're choosing to claim less, because again, this is your program activities allowance is meant to fund the activities of your fellowship, and sometimes the per diem allowance granted by the State Department in a specific city can be very generous. If that's the case and you continue to use this amount, even when your actual food costs aren't that high, then you could quickly exhaust your program activities allowance. So if that's the case and you're choosing to actually claim something that's closer to the cost you incurred, just make sure you note that on your expense report so that we know this was a voluntary choice and not a mistake, and we don't correct it to give you the full amount of per diem. Do not include expenses for spouses, other fellows, State Department employees, etc. And be sure to deduct any expenses from a receipt you do not want us to process or are not allowable. Again, that's the beer with dinner or having laundry on your hotel receipt, or for some reason flowers are not allowable. So very important not to include that. Where fellows go wrong. Too much information versus too little. So while we do need the background information for why why you're choosing to use your program activities allowance, there's some things you don't need to tell us. For example, hotel rooms, we do need to know if you're splitting that room with someone else, you don't need to necessarily tell us the relationship with the other person. Too little information is including a receipt and just saying this is food. We need to know why you're incurring food expenses, etc. Not getting approval for your purchases. Again, approval from your local embassy or the RELO is very important because it's up to their discretion how your program activities allowance is spent. And also not including important information. So just to recap, you need original receipts, receipt forms, and an expense log, your budget, and then the subsequent embassy approval of that budget, exchange rate backup if you're purchasing things that are not in American dollars, airline boarding passes, and then a description of the expense and why it was incurred. So because, as I've mentioned several times now, this is a kind of a federal loan to fund the activities of your fellowship, anything you purchase with this money is not your personal belonging, and it's meant to be left behind. So when that happens, you need to donate the tangible items that you've purchased and leave them behind with either the local host institution or the local embassy. This includes items such as books, printers. It does not include photocopies or office supplies. If you buy a pack of pencils, we're not going to make sure that you note that you've donated that. But larger scale items, definitely we need to have a record of. So in that case, you would fill out a receipt of donated materials form. This includes printers, laptops, USB cords, mouse for computer, and we'll show you an example of that in just a second. This form does not need to be sent upon purchase or when you send the expense report. Instead, this is one instance where you can save the form for your entire fellowship and then include it at the end. And again, this can be emailed to ELF-Reports at Georgetown or also to your program officer. And here's an example of the receipt of donated materials form. So it's pretty basic. It also has some directions at top. Then your host institution, city, country, who you're donating the materials to, your information, and then just a description and an initial of the person who received it. Okay. If you have any questions, please make sure to email those to your program officer. And thank you for your time and attention during this presentation.